were never invisible. That is the first thing you need to understand, not as comfort, not as reassurance. As a forensic observation, you were never invisible. You were taken for granted, which is a completely different wound, and the distinction matters more than you have allowed yourself to admit. Invisible things go unnoticed because they are not there. You were there, fully there, painfully there. You were the one who reached out first, always first. The one who checked in when there was silence, who filled the silence when it lasted too long, who translated your care into words and sent those words into what felt, over time, more and more like a void. You wrote the long messages, the honest ones, the ones that took something real out of you to write, and you watched those messages get received, read, replied to with 2 sentences, sometimes 3, often less. You told yourself that was fine. You told yourself that people show love differently. You told yourself that their quietness was not absence, it was just a different language. But deep inside something you have not yet named, you knew. You knew that you were working harder than you should have been. You knew that the emotional weight of this relationship, this friendship, this dynamic was being carried mostly by you. And instead of setting it down, you carried it further. You told yourself that if you could just explain it clearly enough, just once, if you could find the exact right words, if you could make them understand the depth of what you felt and the sincerity of what you offered, they would finally see you. Stop. That was never a communication problem. That was a recognition problem dressed up as a communication problem so you could keep trying, so the door could stay open, so the hope could survive. Because the moment you admitted it was a recognition problem, you would have had to face the harder truth, that someone can understand you perfectly and still not value you. That clarity does not create appreciation. That explaining yourself to someone who is comfortable with your emotional labor costs nothing but the explanation itself. They were comfortable. That is the entire sentence. That is the entire psychology. They were comfortable, and you were the infrastructure of that comfort, and infrastructure is never appreciated until it fails. Think about it. You do not think about the electricity in your walls until the power goes out. You do not think about your lungs until you cannot breathe. You do not think about water until there is none. The things that regulate life silently, consistently, without drama, those are the things that get absorbed into the background, that get mistaken for permanence, that get used without the ceremony of gratitude because their presence feels like a natural law rather than a choice. Your presence felt like a natural law to them. Your availability, your warmth, your willingness to reach out, to show up, to forgive the inconsistency, to stay loyal through the long stretches of their emotional absence. They did not value it because they did not have to. It was simply there, like air, like light through a window, there every morning without effort, without negotiation, without conditions. And every time you gave more, you extended that feeling of permanence. Every message you sent that did not need to be sent, it told them you would always send one. Every time you returned after being ignored, it told them you would always return. Every time you explained your feelings and then accepted the dry response and moved on without consequence, it told them that your boundaries were not really boundaries. They were requests, gentle ones, easily bypassed. You did not mean it that way. You were not weak. You were not foolish. You were loyal. You were generous. You led with love because love is what you believed in, and there is nothing wrong with that. Nothing. The instinct itself is not the wound. The instinct is beautiful. The wound came from applying that instinct endlessly to a situation that did not honor it. You cannot love someone into recognizing you. Say that again, slowly, because it is the thing you have been running from. You cannot love someone into recognizing you. You can only love them. And if they do not recognize what that love costs, what it means, what it is, more love does not produce recognition. It produces expectation. It produces a quiet psychological dependence they may not even be aware of. It produces a comfort so deep that your presence becomes inseparable from their sense of emotional stability. And then one day, without announcement, without drama, without a speech, you stop. Not because you became cold, not because you stopped caring, not because you chose indifference as a strategy or a manipulation or a game. You stopped because you were exhausted in a way that sleep cannot reach. You stopped because something inside you finally ran out. Not of love. Love does not simply run out, but of the willingness to pour that love into something that kept returning empty. You went quiet, and that silence, your silence, did something. It is late at night, and you are no longer checking your phone. Not compulsively, not anxiously, not with that particular kind of desperate hope where you pick it up and put it back down and pick it up again. Not because anyone has messaged you, but because some part of your nervous system has been trained to keep looking, conditioned by 1,000 small disappointments dressed as almost connections. You have spent months, maybe years in that loop, reaching, waiting, adjusting your expectations downward to fit the reality being offered to you. But now you are not looking, and somewhere across that distance, they feel it. They feel it not as a thought, not immediately as a realization, but as a subtle displacement. Like a room that was always warm suddenly having a draft. They reach for the comfort they had always reached for unconsciously, and it is not there. They send a message, maybe something small, something casual, maybe something designed to look like it is not reaching, because reaching would require them to acknowledge that they lost something, and they were never quite prepared for the idea that you could be lost. Because you were permanent, you were the one who stayed until you weren't, and now they are sitting inside the consequences of taking permanence for granted. But here is what you need to understand, and this is the part that matters most. This is not about them finally seeing you. That framing is too small for what is happening to you, too focused outward, too dependent on their realization for your resolution. What is actually happening is something that belongs entirely to you. You are discovering what peace feels like without the noise of constant pursuit. And it does not feel like what you thought it would feel like. You thought detachment would feel like relief, immediate and clean. Instead, it feels strange, a little hollow, a little grease-shaped, because the reaching itself had become a ritual. The checking, the hoping, the explaining, the waiting. It had become its own form of purpose. A painful one, but a structured one. And now the structure is gone. Sit in that. Do not rush to fill it. Do not replace the scrolling through their profile with scrolling through someone else's. Do not replace the late-night messages used to write with content consumption until you fall asleep overstimulated and emotionally numb. Do not trade one form of avoidance for another and call it healing. Sit in the strangeness of a life that is no longer organized around someone else's emotional schedule. Because this feeling, this uncomfortable, unfamiliar, almost silent feeling, this is not emptiness. This is space. There is a difference. Emptiness is a wound that needs filling. Space is a condition that allows growth, but they feel almost identical in the early stages. And that is why most people panic and run back. They sit inside the strange quiet of finally stopping the chase, and they mistake the discomfort of space for the agony of emptiness, and they reach back out. They send the message. They reopen the door they had finally closed, and then the cycle continues, not because they are weak, because they were never taught the difference. You have been living inside a kind of emotional economy that punished silence and rewarded pursuit. Every time the connection felt like it was fading, you chased. Every time the distance grew, you closed it. And that economy, that system, it was not love. It was a trap, a quiet one. The kind that does not announce itself as a trap because you walked into it willingly and kept choosing to stay. Ask yourself something honest. When did you last feel valued without having to pursue the feeling? When did someone reach for you first? When did the effort come from their side without you first creating the conditions for it? Without you setting the opener, making yourself available, demonstrating that the door was still open? When did you feel seen without having to position yourself in someone's line of sight? If you are struggling to remember, that is information, not about your worth, about the dynamic you were living inside of. Your worth was never the variable. Your worth was constant, a fixed, unchanging reality that existed before this relationship began and will exist long after the last message is exchanged. What was variable, what was always variable, was whether the person in front of you had the emotional depth to perceive that worth without being forced into perception by your absence. Some people can only calculate loss. They cannot perceive value while it is present, not because they are evil, not because they are heartless, but because they were never required to develop that particular emotional skill. Because someone, maybe more than one someone, was always there to absorb their indifference without consequence, to stay regardless, to love through the dismissal and keep showing up in the morning. You were one of those people who stayed, until you learned what staying was costing you. And the cost was not just emotional energy. The cost was something more intimate and more severe. The cost was your sense of self. Because when you spend enough time organizing your emotional life around someone else's recognition, when your sense of value begins to depend on whether they text back, whether they show up, whether they finally say the words you have been waiting to hear, you begin to lose the thread of who you are independently of that waiting. You become defined by the pursuit, and the pursuit becomes your identity. There's something quietly devastating about that, about looking in the mirror one day and realizing that so much of your internal life has been shaped by one person's inconsistency. That your moods followed their patterns, that a good day was good because they reached out, and a bad day was bad because they didn't, and you built a kind of invisible architecture around the hope that they would eventually see you. That architecture has to come down, not violently, not in anger, not in a speech designed to finally make them understand, because the speech does not work. It never worked. It only gave you the temporary feeling of being heard while the fundamental dynamic remained exactly the same. The architecture comes down in silence, quietly, privately. In the late night hours when you put the phone face down and you do not pick it up. When you feel the pull, and you will feel the pull, the trained reflex of a nervous system conditioned to reach, and you stay still. When you write the message in your head and then you do not send it. When you see something that would have made you reach out before, and you let it pass through you without becoming a reason to reconnect. That is not coldness. That is discipline. That is the slow, unglamorous, deeply personal work of reclaiming your own emotional center. Because here is what they never tell you about emotional detachment. Real detachment, not the performed kind, not the strategic withdrawal designed to make someone miss you. Real detachment is not about them at all. It is entirely about you. It is the decision made quietly and with full clarity that your emotional life deserves a foundation more stable than someone else's availability. That your sense of value is too important to leave in someone else's custody. You have been handing the keys to your self-worth to people who did not know what to do with them. Take them back, not loudly. Not with a message explaining what you have decided and why. Not with the long final paragraph that lays out every grievance and every unreciprocated moment, in the hope that the comprehensiveness of your pain will finally produce the recognition you needed. That message, you know that message. It lives in your drafts folder or in your head, and it is beautifully written, and it says everything true, and it would change nothing. Delete it. Not because your feelings are wrong. Your feelings are completely right, but because that message is not for them. That message is a final attempt to make their recognition a condition of your peace. And your peace cannot be conditional anymore. It cannot wait at the door of someone else's understanding. Your peace has to belong to you. Walk away from the version of yourself that kept waiting for the verdict. You were never on trial. You never needed to prove your value to anyone who required proof. Real recognition does not come through proof. It comes through attention, through the quiet, consistent act of noticing what someone brings to your life while they are still bringing it. And that kind of attention, it cannot be produced by explanation. It cannot be forced into existence by love. It is either present present or it is not. And in the places where it is not present, you must stop building your home. There is something that happens in the aftermath of finally going silent that no one prepares you for. Something subtle and initially uncomfortable and ultimately transformative. The world does not dramatically rearrange itself. No one appears with an apology perfectly calibrated to your pain. The phone does not explode with the sudden overwhelming recognition you were waiting for. But something shifts. It shifts inside you first. Before anything external changes, if anything external changes, something in your interior landscape becomes quieter. The constant low-frequency hum of anxiety that lived in you. The checking, the hoping, the interpreting, the analyzing of dry replies for hidden warmth. That hum begins to fade. Not immediately, gradually. The way a sound fades when you finally close the window you forgot was open. And in that quiet, in that genuine, unperformed quiet, you begin to remember who you were before the pursuit. Before you organized your emotional life around one person's inconsistency, before you measured your worth in someone else's responses, before you confused availability with connection and loyalty with self-erasure, you begin to remember that you have a self that exists entirely independent of their attention. And that self, the one that was always there, waiting beneath the noise of constant reaching. That self has dignity. Real dignity. Not the performed kind, not the kind you wear in public to hide the fact that you are hurting. Real dignity, the kind that exists in private. The kind that says, I will not continue to offer my best self to a space that returns it diminished. I will not explain my worth to someone who has consistently chosen not to perceive it. I will not mistake the comfort I provided for love they offered in return. That distinction is everything. Protect it, because the world is full of situations designed to erode it. Relationships that drain without replenishing. Dynamics that require you to shrink. Digital environments built to simulate connection while producing its opposite. The endless scroll. The notification that promises meaning and delivers noise. The validation loop that teaches you to perform feeling rather than experience it. To curate your pain rather than sit inside it and let it transform you. You have been living inside that erosion, and you have been confusing the noise for substance. The late night doom scrolling, that is not rest. That is avoidance wearing the costume of winding down. The compulsive checking of someone's profile, that is not interest. That is the withdrawal symptom of an emotional dependency you have not yet admitted to yourself. The way you light up when they finally respond, the brief warmth of it, the way it recalibrates your entire mood for a few hours, that is not love, that is relief. That is the specific relief of someone addicted to an uncertain reward, receiving the signal they have been waiting for. That addiction has a name. It is not weakness. It is not pathology. It is what happens to any nervous system that has been conditioned by inconsistency. When reward is unpredictable, when warmth comes and goes without pattern, the system does not disengage. It intensifies. It becomes more vigilant, more attuned, more desperate for the signal. Because the uncertainty itself becomes the mechanism of attachment. You are not loving them freely. You are chasing certainty in an uncertain dynamic. And now that you have stopped chasing, now that the silence has set in, you may find that what you miss is not them exactly, not their specific presence, but the ritual, the structure, the feeling, however painful, of being oriented towards something. Let that be the last honest thing you admit about it, and then let it go. Let it go, not as a performance of strength, not as a spiritual declaration you make loudly so someone can witness your growth. Let it go privately, simply in the way you let go of breath, quietly, without announcement, without requiring the letting go to produce an immediate lightness. Some things take time to lift. Some grief is slow and undramatic and asks nothing of you except patience with yourself. Be patient. Be patient with the mornings when you still reach for your phone before you are fully awake. Be patient with the moments when something funny happens and your first thought is to share it with them. Be patient with the strange, specific sadness of realizing that someone who was woven into your daily life has become someone you no longer speak to. Not because of hatred, not because of dramatic rupture, but because the silence finally became more honest than anything you could have said. That silence was not defeat. That silence was the most truthful thing you ever offered them. Because in that silence, in your withdrawal, in your quiet removal of the emotional certainty you had always provided, you gave them the one thing that all your explanations and messages and patience could not give them. You gave them reality, the reality of what your absence feels like, the reality of what life is without the warmth they had learned to take for granted, the reality that permanence was never guaranteed, that you were always a choice they made passively by not choosing anything else, and that passive choices have consequences when the option disappears. Whether they have the capacity to respond to that reality honestly, whether they reach back with genuine feeling or surface-level contact, whether they acknowledge what was lost or simply seek to restore their comfort, that is not your burden anymore. You are not responsible for their realization. You are only responsible for your own. And your realization is this: you are not a supporting character in someone else's emotional narrative. You are not the stable backdrop against which other people live more vividly. You are not the person who waits. You are not defined by your availability, your patience, your willingness to stay when everything in you understood that staying was costing you something sacred. You are the person who finally chose themselves, quietly, without applause, without the dramatic turning point that makes a good story. Just the slow, deliberate, private decision to stop bleeding, for people who learn to mistake your bleeding for your natural state. That decision does not require their acknowledgement to be real. Their missing you does not validate your worth. Your worth was always real, with or without their recognition. Their sudden attention after your silence does not mean they have changed. Attention and understanding are different currencies, and one can't exist without the other. Their discomfort at your absence does not mean you owe them your return. You are not responsible for the emotional regulation of people who refuse to regulate their appreciation of you. You are allowed to be at peace, without explanation, without a final message that ties everything together, without waiting for the moment where everything is resolved and understood and properly mourned. Some things end without resolution. Some people leave your emotional life, not with a dramatic exit, but with the slow, accumulating weight of a silence that finally became permanent. And that lack of resolution, that absence of the conversation where everything is finally said, it does not have to be a wound. It can be a door that closed cleanly, a chapter that ended without a tidy final paragraph, because life is rarely that neat, and the neatness you were waiting for was itself a trap. A reason to keep the door open, to keep the conversation available, to keep yourself positioned in hope of a conclusion that honors the investment you made. You do not need that conclusion from them. You can give it to yourself. Here, now, in the quiet. The conclusion is this: you gave something real. You loved something genuinely. You showed up with the full weight of who you are, and that was not nothing. That was everything. And the fact that it was not fully seen does not make it less real, does not make it wasted, does not mean you should have offered less. It means you now know what you are capable of, what you carry, what you are willing to give, and what you are no longer willing to give without reciprocity. That knowledge is not a wound. That is wisdom, earned, paid for in the currency of exhaustion and patience, and finally, silence. Walk forward with it, not loudly, not with a new version of yourself assembled for performance, just forward, with the quiet, unshakable knowledge that your value does not require a witness, that your peace does not require their understanding, that the stillness you feel now, this strange, unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable calm that arrived the moment you stopped chasing, this is not absence. This is what it feels like to finally come home to yourself. Stay here.